Good afternoon. I'm Marta Hernandez, and on behalf of the National Committee for Effective Literacy, NCEL, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on effective literacy education for English learners beyond foundational skills. The need for effective literacy programs, approaches, and instruction for all children is important because literacy, the ability to communicate, read, and write, is at the very heart of education. For the almost 10 million U.S. school children who are enrolling in our schools with a home language other than English and learning English as a second language, appropriate, effective literacy education that addresses their needs as second language learners and as dual language learners is an urgent educational equity issue facing our nation. Today's webinar will share the findings, recommendations, and call to action in a paper that was commissioned by and is being released today as part of the launch of the National Committee for Effective Literacy. You will hear more about NCEL and our work at the end of the webinar. But first, we are pleased to bring you two of three authors of the paper, both who are scholars, experts, and leaders in English learner and dual language education. Dr. Lori Olson was the founding director and now serves as strategic advisor to NCEL, Sobrato Early Academic Language, and has designed, demonstrated, evaluated, and implemented effective pre-K to 12th grade English learner programs and services throughout California for the past 4 decades. As a researcher, writer, and provider of leadership development and technical assistance related to immigrant and English learner education and language access, Dr. Olson has published dozens of books, articles, and videos on English learner education. Dr. Kathy Escamilla is professor of education in the Division of Educational Equity and Cultural Diversity at the University of Colorado at Boulder. She is one of the creators of the Literacy Squared program. Dr. Escamilla's research focuses on issues related to the development of bilingualism and biliteracy for Spanish-speaking emergent bilingual children. She has authored 3 books and over 50 research articles on topics related to biliteracy for Spanish-speaking children in the U.S. The authors will provide an overview for understanding the current context in which our discussion about effective literacy for English learner emergent bilingual students is taking place and why it is so urgent. They will focus on the research on effective literacy instruction for English learner emergent bilingual students and will review, document, and discuss what is dangerously missing from current national literacy initiatives and trends that focus narrowly on foundational skills such as phonics. Each will also share results from 2 different on-the-ground, research-based and research-tested comprehensive literacy models that are the applications of what is known about effective literacy instruction, centralizing the needs and assets of English learner emergent bilingual students. The webinar will close with the sharing of recommendations of the paper, a description of NCEL and new resources being launched today, and an opportunity for the authors' presenters to answer some questions. In the short amount of time we have, the presenters cannot do more than scratch the surface of this important topic, and we hope that you will read the full paper, which will be posted in the chat. If you have a question you would like to pose to the presenters, open the Q&A window, enter your question into the Q&A box, and click send. We will answer questions as time allows at the end of the webinar. And so at this time, I'm going to turn this over to our first presenter.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Lori Olson, one of the authors of the paper we're presenting today. A paper that we wrote not just because it's an interesting educational topic, which it is, but because it is so urgent. 10 million, as Martha said, of the school children in our nation speak a language other than English at home and enroll in schools where they face the challenge not only of learning this new language, but they're also building their knowledge and skills in all their core academic subjects, most often taught in a language that they haven't yet mastered. They enter a school system that too often has them leave their home language at the door and too often lacks the capacity to understand and embrace them as dual language learners. As a result, we typically see they have lower achievement test scores in reading and also in math and every subject tested for federal accountability. And commonly in a subtractive process, as they develop English, most fail to develop their home language and lose the asset of their potential bilingualism. They're twice as likely to drop out as their native English-speaking peers and are less likely to attend a four-year college. All over the country today, we hear about a literacy crisis and the unacceptably large number of students who are not at grade level in reading, made all the more urgent in this time of COVID, where we're trying to deal with lost time in school. This concern is fueling new legislation, calls for more investments in literacy instruction, the search for effective instructional approaches and reading curriculum, and efforts to rethink teacher preparation related to teaching reading. And seeking to get it right and to target investments wisely, there's also a demand that we base what we do on literacy instruction on research, on what we know. This is crucial. We're playing with children's lives and their futures. But, and this is a big but, how closely and wisely are people vetting what loosely gets described as a science of reading? In the name of being evidence-driven and research-based, what has too often been packaged under that term, science of reading, has been problematic for many students, but particularly and decidedly so for our English learners. Too often, what's offered under the guise of, quote, science, unquote, actually does not reflect what we know to be the research and science of literacy and language development for English learners. So our goal with this paper was to make clear what a science of reading that is based on what we know about English learners and dual language development. Because all students should be taught in ways appropriate for them, especially when the stakes are so high, and because we have too much experience from the past with narrow and one-size-fits-all blanket reading and literacy approaches that have failed English learners to let it happen again. We just cannot allow, we cannot afford to lose another generation of students to ineffective instructional programs that aren't designed or delivered based on what we know they need. And so our paper is offered to you today as guidance about what we should be doing in literacy instruction for our English learners, and as a counter narrative to what is becoming a prevailing and misinformed and dangerous viewpoint. Before I get into what does and doesn't work, though, we want to get a little sense of the degree to what I'm alluding to now is actually happening where you are. Luckily, we have 48 states and the District of Columbia represented on this call today. And we'd like to just see to what extent is the narrow focus on foundational skills and the science of reading narrative evident in the rollout of new literacy initiatives and policies in your context, wherever you are, whatever role. And secondly, to what extent on a scale of 1 to 5 are you concerned about this narrow focus? So please answer our poll and we'll see where we are. You keep voting, keep voting. We've got more of you out there. In fact, we have 422 participants, which is pretty amazing. And so what we're seeing so far is that, yes, very, very evident or somewhat evident throughout the country is this kind of narrative. And on a scale of 1 to 5, how concerned are you? Obviously, you're on this call today, on this webinar. And when we look at it, we see that the vast majority of you are, in fact, very concerned. I'm going to let the poll run for just another minute because I'm curious about that last 100 of you and whether this is resonating with you, whether you are also concerned, whether you're also hearing this narrative throughout the country. So thank you very much for participating in our poll. It gives us a little sense that indeed what we are facing, what we are seeing, you also are seeing. And we hope that this research paper and this webinar can bring us all together about what needs to be done. So one of the things that we know is that narrow and one-size-fits-all literacy approaches have failed English learners in the past. So first, I'm going to share with you a little bit of history as context and as warning. Let me get rid of my poll results. Whoops. In the 1990s, concern about a reading crisis in the United States fueled national research and policies that were aimed at trying to close gaps and address the literacy crisis back then. And the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 ushered in a federal $1 billion a year campaign of professional development known as Reading First, which was a key part of holding schools accountable for ensuring that all students would score at grade level in reading by third grade. Reading First required schools to adopt, quote, scientific research-based reading programs, based in large part on the research of the National Reading Panel, which several years earlier had summarized the research on literacy instruction as a set of 5 components of reading: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. The National Reading Panel was a really important leap forward in defining effective reading instruction. But as they explained in the introduction to their report itself, the panel, quote, and I quote, "The panel did not address issues relevant to second language learning," unquote. And yet, despite this, a one-size-fits-all scientific literacy approach was implemented for all students, including English learners, with structures in place to ensure implementation with fidelity. As this graphic depicts, there was this major narrowing of the understanding of language and literacy that was whittled down from that broad, robust understanding to a focus on literacy. So, for example, oral language largely fell away from instruction during this time. It was all about literacy. And then that narrowed focus on literacy got narrowed further to be primarily a matter of reading, de-emphasizing writing and the key interrelationship between reading and writing. So literacy instruction became thought of just as reading instruction. And then the understanding of reading instruction was further narrowed from the 5 components that the National Reading Panel had described to a focus primarily on foundational reading skills. And even that was further narrowed to phonics or decoding, so small you can barely see it on the right side of that screen, but somehow amplified in practice to being what people thought about when they thought about what reading instruction needed to be. An extensive evaluation of Reading First found that while there was a significant impact on decoding skills among first grade students, it didn't hold for subsequent grades. And furthermore, the evaluation found that Reading First did not produce an impact on reading comprehension at all in grades 1, 2, 3. And there was no improvement on student motivation or engagement in literacy either. Across the nation, gaps in literacy skills for our English learners did not close. And indeed, the National Assessment for Education Progress, the NAEP, confirmed Reading First failure to reduce reading gaps for this population. Well, 5 years after No Child Left Behind was signed and Reading First was funded, and 9 years after the National Reading Panel released their report void of attention to second language learners, the National Literacy Panel for Language Minority Children and Youth report was released. And this new report affirmed the importance of all 5 of those components of a comprehensive reading approach that had been described by the National Reading Panel, including foundational skills, but found these components are not sufficient for English learners, and made clear that effective literacy instruction for English learners was different in significant ways from instruction for monolingual students. The report described the linguistic and cognitive and sociocultural and academic variables that compound the reading challenges for English learners, and how these students require additional specific instructional considerations. The report found that efficient reading comprehension depends not only on efficient word recognition skills, which is how people tend to think of reading instruction, but also on general language proficiency. Remember that broad understanding of language that I showed at the beginning of that narrowing graphic. It made clear also the role of home language, the uniqueness of the dual language brain, the importance of cross-language interactions, the viability of bilingual approaches, and it made clear why the Reading First, one-size-fits-all science of reading literacy approach hasn't worked. It failed English learners in the past. Unfortunately, it threatens to fail them again. Fortunately, we have a strong and consistent and coherent academic research and literature base to guide effective literacy approaches for English learners. And I'm going to describe some key elements from that research as it applies to students who are in mainstream or ESL or English taught settings, or in California, what we call integrated ELD settings. At the heart of that work is the fundamental understanding that the development of language and literacy for students with 2 or more languages is distinctly different from monolingual literacy development, that the development of literacy for a dual language brain is not the same as for a monolingual brain, because the new language and literacy system is being developed in the presence of and in interaction with an existing language system. They already have a language, and they're developing literacy as a second language learner. It's in relationship and comparison to knowledge of their first language that the elements of the new language, such as vocabulary and phonological components and grammatic structures and writing systems, are learned, and the understanding of different language systems develops. And this is crucial in reading instruction. Let me describe 8 aspects of what effective literacy approaches for English learners really means. First of all, it's a comprehensive approach that teaches foundational skills in context and along with other components of reading instruction. So I want to be really clear here, read my lips. Systematic, explicit instruction in phonics is a part of a comprehensive reading approach, a part, and never in isolation. Effective literacy instruction integrates meaning making, language development, and foundational skills. An effective literacy approach emphasizes oracy, that's oral language development, to accelerate literacy acquisition. As students learn to speak the new language, they're expanding the repertoire of vocabulary that gives literacy meaning. Those words on a page have meaning, and they're internalizing the sounds of the new language that will be represented in print. And they're developing awareness of how English is structured as a language. Oral language is the foundation for literacy. And fourth, an effective literacy approach for English learners addresses writing and reading as interrelated sister skills. The process of turning sounds and words into print, into text, of seeing how what you say can be written down, is the mirror process of seeing letters and text on the page, then sounding them out and recognizing them as words. Writing is a key foundational skill component along with reading foundational skills, part and parcel of early literacy. And it also embraces the literacy purpose of voice and expression and purpose. Continuing on, fifth, effective literacy instruction for English learners builds background knowledge and integrates literacy development and development of content knowledge. Background knowledge helps all students become better readers, but it is essential for English learners for whom the words they're decoding can only have meaning if they understand those words. The research has consistently found that English learner students benefit significantly from an emphasis on meaning and background knowledge. Sixth, an effective literacy approach for English learners makes and draws upon cross-language connections. Because remember, they're entering into this with another language, an existing home language, a dual language brain. And they're engaged as little linguistic geniuses in the process of building and sorting 2 language systems in relationship to each other. Our English learners live in and across multiple language worlds, and wherever they go, they're encountering print, signs, cereal boxes, posters, etc. At home and in their communities, this print environment is likely to be in their home language. At school, the print environment in literacy instruction is in English. So it's important that they learn as part of reading instruction that letter symbols don't always represent the same sounds in their home language as they do in English, that there are ways texts work similarly and ways they work differently in the 2 languages because the language systems are different, that the word D-I-M-E is pronounced dime in English, if you've already learned that lazy E makes the I say I, and means a 10-cent coin, while that same D-I-M-E is pronounced dime in Spanish and means give me. Literacy instruction that supports students in making cross-language connections helps them focus on the similarities and differences between the languages, heightening their understanding of language and literacy overall, as they clarify what transfers from their known language to English and what does not. They learn to understand how English is structured, that in English, for example, as they read a sentence, they're going to encounter an adjective, a describing word before the noun, while in Spanish, the adjective comes after the noun, Casablanca versus White House. These cross-language connections, this meta-linguistic awareness and understanding is powerful in helping English learners develop literacy. And furthermore, cross-language connections leverage and support the home language as well as they build that muscle of the bilingual brain, gaining the cognitive advantages we know bilingualism confers. Conversely, cutting off the home language, treating them as if they were monolingual, just learning a new language, failing to recognize their home language and the dual language-ness as part of the picture of literacy development, actually hinders literacy development. And I'll say that again, it hinders literacy development because it doesn't allow them to use their linguistic resources. We need to support their emerging literacy by explicitly building cross-language awareness. And I know that what people think is, well, how can we do that? The teachers don't speak their languages. Teachers needn't know all of their children's languages. They needn't be bilingual themselves to learn about the features of different languages, to understand some of the key ways in which they're the same as different, and to support children in developing their own bilingual awareness. It's an important part of teaching literacy effectively to second language learners. Seventh, effective literacy for English learners addresses sociocultural factors, building on what students already know, what they bring, their cultural practices as assets. And that means teachers have to incorporate student experience, use a wide variety of materials and instructional strategies that reflect and engage culture as children learn to read and write. Asset orientation is a key piece of effective literacy. And lastly, number 8, effective literacy instruction utilizes meaningful assessment, linguistically valid and reliable assessments, and whenever possible, assesses what students can do in and across their 2 languages as they engage in literacy. Assessments that actually and more accurately can inform teachers as to what students really understand about literacy and reading and are able to produce. So no, it's not the same as literacy instruction for monolingual students. And yes, we do know what effective literacy instruction is for English learners. Now, I want to share with you one example of a language and literacy approach that is both based on the research that I've been talking about, so it illustrates research in action, and it's also research tested, so we see that it actually works. NCEL is an English learner-focused approach to education that's rooted in research and designed to be implemented as an approach for all students. So I'm going to briefly tell you about the NCEL story, the Sobrato Early Academic Language Story. In 2008, the Sobrato Family Foundation partnered with me to design and pilot a comprehensive approach to English learner education in preschool and early elementary grades. It was designed as a pilot explicitly because the National Literacy Panel on Language Minority Children and Youth had just released their report, and we wanted to offer a living example of that research in action as an alternative to the English-only models and narrow literacy instruction we saw modeled in Reading First. After strong outcomes from an external evaluation 3 years into the NCEL pilot, replication of the model began. And now, more than a decade later, NCEL partners with educators across California, transforming classrooms into language-rich, rigorous, joyful learning environments that integrate language, literacy, and learning, and centralizing the needs of English learners. This was aided significantly by California's adoption of the Common Core standards and a new state English language arts, English language development framework that described language and literacy development in ways very aligned to the research that we just reviewed, emphasizing and embracing all 4 domains of language: reading, writing, listening, and speaking, emphasizing language and literacy development in and through all disciplines across the curriculum in all classrooms, and understanding the interrelationship among the 5 key components of language and literacy development. You can see them in the circles of what some call the California turtle. Foundational skills, effective expression, oral and written, language development, meaning making, content knowledge, and going the further step of understanding that English learners required, in addition, explicit attention to second language development and dual language development. For teachers who are pivoting from that Reading First era into this new Common Core era, and now encountering the integration of language development and literacy and content knowledge, this was a very big lift. And so NCEL was designed fundamentally as both a professional learning and systems alignment approach. It is not an isolated reading curriculum or even an isolated literacy curriculum. It is about reading instruction and literacy development as part and parcel of language development and a larger educational pedagogy, enacted through high quality professional learning that's job embedded and sustained and collaborative and reflective with coaching and facilitation support. Now, I promised you this was an example of something that was not only based on the research, but illuminates the research in action and is also research tested. Most recently in a rigorous, multi-year, externally funded and externally conducted evaluation. Using both quantitative and qualitative methods, the evaluation studied both SEAL impacts and its scalability in 67 schools from 12 districts across the state, tracking both student data and classroom impacts following 3 cohorts of students across a 7-year period. The evaluation found that based on classroom observations, there's the cohorts, based on classroom observations, teachers in SEAL schools significantly increased their use of research-based best practices for teaching English learners, similar to what we've already described. They were actually implementing the model. They were implementing the research base I described to you earlier. Teachers also reported being more collaborative, more enthusiastic about teaching, more confident in their knowledge and skills, and more effective at engaging the families of English learners in their children's learning and making home to school connection. And I want to be clear, the vast majority of these teachers were not bilingual teachers. They were teaching in an English context. And SEAL students demonstrated positive outcomes in language and literacy and were more joyful, confident, and engaged. The reclassification rates, that's what in California we call when we declare them as proficient in English, increased from the prior rates in those same schools. And most English learners in our schools had started kindergarten with very beginning or early intermediate levels of English fluency. And by 4th grade, most had well-developed English skills or been reclassified at higher rates than the statewide English learner average, despite having started at lower levels. So higher than the state average, despite having started lower. And by 4th grade, SEAL students performed as well or better than their peers statewide in English language arts, which includes measures of reading and in math, despite the fact that SEAL schools have higher concentrations of socioeconomically disadvantaged students, which is a condition often associated with lower academic outcomes. After instituting SEAL, districts reported far fewer long-term English learners. So, hooray, there you got it. SEAL is just one illustration of the application of the effective literacy research base for English learners, just one example of what it can look like when we heed the research base on English learners, and evidence that it can be done. And now, before I hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Kathy Escamilla, to talk about effective literacy development in a dual language biliteracy context, I want to just pause for a minute to remind you, you can be posting questions in the question function, and we will be answering questions at the end of the webinar. So thank you all, and take it away, Dr. Escamilla.
Thank you so much, Lori. Hasn't this been wonderful? And I do want to start by just re-emphasizing how much we do know about how to teach emerging bilingual kids, whether they are in English medium programs or whether or not they are fortunate enough to be in school situations where they are being encouraged and allowed to develop both 2 languages and 2 literacies. And so I'm going to spend my next few minutes talking about effective literacy education for English learners in a bilingual, biliteracy context. So Lori's okay. Remind you all something that we know. We all know that we have one brain, and many of us, as a matter of fact, most people in the world are fortunate enough to have one brain and 2 languages. So I'm going to remind you what is in the paper, that bilingualism is not 2 monolinguals in one mind. Bilingualism is not the presence of 2 separate language systems and identities, and you all know that. It involves the intersection of 2 or more languages within the mind and life experiences of an individual. When I am speaking Spanish to someone, I have my English drawer open. I don't close the Spanish drawer. Both the Spanish and the English drawer are open. If someone talks to me in Spanish and I don't quite understand everything they say, I can think about it in English. I can think about the words I know in Spanish. I can formulate a response in English. Sometimes then I put it in Spanish and then I talk back to the person. All of this enables me to better process information and understand across languages. That brings me to the second point. Language processing in the bilingual mind differs from the monolingual mind. Anyone who says good teaching is just good teaching and what's good in English is good in all languages has been disproven over the last 30 years in a resounding way. Lived experiences and brain development of bilinguals are unique and different, thereby necessitating different pedagogical approaches. If I say I'm going to a quinceañera this Saturday, it's not because I don't know how to say quinceañera in English. It's because I'm going to a quinceañera, and that's what it's called. If someone says, what is that? I'm perfectly capable of using circumlocution to explain what a quinceañera is. Finally, the development of language and literacy for students with 2 or more languages is distinctly different from monolingual literacy development, and that's what my portion of this session is to talk about today. And I am going to give you one example from research that I've been involved in for the past 18 years. And that is from a program I've been involved in that's called Literacy Squared, or Lectoescritura al Cuadrado. We have a book, it's called Biliteracy in Action. That's not a shameless promotion. It's simply to say we have research, and we have research that's with real children in real schools. And this is but one example of many going on around the country. So next slide. These are the authors and the founders of Literacy Squared. We are located at the University of Colorado in Boulder, but we have colleagues in around the country, and you will see that shortly. Okay, so we were created in 2004, and here was our mission. Our focus on biliteracy was different than most bilingual programs of the time, in that our focus was on literacy. The focus was on the beginning to develop both literacy skills in Spanish and English from kindergarten. Many of the programs in 2004 were transitional bilingual programs that developed children's reading and writing, say, in Spanish first, and then added on English in the 2nd or the 3rd grade. Very different about Literacy Squared was that we began the development of 2 languages in kindergarten. We know how brilliant bilingual brains are. We know that most of our kids are born in this country and come to school knowing some English and some Spanish. And those simultaneous bilingual kids are perfectly capable of developing language and literacy in 2 languages. So our mission was to develop instructional programs that valued and honored and allowed kids to develop bilingualism and biliteracy in Spanish and English, with the concomitant development of the assessment tools. Because if we're going to teach in 2 languages and assess in only one, we are never going to fully understand how biliteracy develops in this country. And we need that research base to support the academic legitimacy of biliteracy development in the US. And by the way, none of the studies that we have done to date, and that is on the next slide, none of the studies that we have done to date have indicated to us that by teaching kids to read and write in 2 languages concurrently, that we have slowed down the development of English. So over the 18-year history of our program, we have impacted schools and children across the United States, and we have projects in Mexico and Brazil. We started with a pilot study in 2005 in 13 schools, 10 in Colorado and 3 in Texas. 18 years later, we have had projects in 7 states, impacting 450 teachers and 13,000 emerging bilingual children. Okay, so what have we learned? In our lessons learned, we have developed 1 book and are in the final throes of a second. We've published 18 referee journal articles, 18 technical reports involving all of the schools we've been involved in. 5 dissertations have been written about the project and 12 book chapters. I'm not telling you this because I want to impress you with the work that we've done. I want to impress upon you that we do know how language and literacy develops in emerging bilingual kids in Spanish and English, and we know that it is not the same as monolingual English literacy development. So, okay, so this is a map of the US so that you can see where we have done our work. I'm going to show you a framework now of what our holistic biliteracy framework consists of. You will notice that we have all kinds of circles. We like circles in our work. But around the top, you see something called cross-language connections. Cross-language connections has everything to do with the fact that biliteracy is different than monoliteracy. Bilingual children and biliterate children have 2 languages to use in the process of becoming literate. And that, by definition, makes them different. You'll see 2 circles side by side. One says Spanish literacy, and the other one says literacy-based ELD. Within those circles, you will see 4 equally important components of our Literacy Squared program. And they are 4 that include foundational skills, but are not limited by them. So you see oracy, which is the little children in the first little box talking to each other. That is oral language development. You see a book that stands for reading. You see a pencil that stands for writing, and you see a person that's ideating. That stands for metalinguistic development. And you see the same thing represented in literacy-based ELD. And the next slide, so you might say, but what about phonics? What about the foundational skills? Where are they represented? Well, they are actually represented in each one of the quadrants of our framework. So you see that phonics and word work, you see 2 little red circles with arrows pointing to phonics and word work. They are represented both in Spanish and English. Phonics has an important but a limited role in a comprehensive biliteracy program. And I want to say, if you see the quadrant that has oral language development there, a lot of phonemic awareness is meant to be done in oral language development. We worry when we see frameworks presented to schools that propose that 90 minutes of instruction every day be devoted to phonics and decoding. We worry about what's not getting covered in a comprehensive program. The literacy blocks in English and Spanish amount to about 25% of instructional time being devoted to what we would call foundational skills. But again, that is part of a program and not the entire program. We move on. So one example of research that we have conducted at the University of Colorado in partnership with one of our first partners, the Salem-Keizer School District in Oregon, was published in the Journal of Literacy Research in 2016. And what it did was it examined student outcomes in Spanish and English reading and writing, and we compared our Literacy Squared model to a comparable control group. And I want to say a little bit about that control group. The control group were kids who were in transitional bilingual programs in the same school district. And so in the school district, when Literacy Squared was implemented there, 13 of the schools became Literacy Squared schools, and other schools maintained their transitional bilingual programs. So the Literacy Squared students were in grades K to 3. The intervention or the control students were in K to 2, and then they joined Literacy Squared in the 3rd grade. There were 13 schools, 167 kids in Literacy Squared classrooms, 191 in the control classrooms. We gave annual assessments in Spanish and English in reading and writing from kindergarten to through the 3rd grade. The Spanish and English were EDL and DRA, and the English was a writing prompt that was developed by Literacy Squared and a rubric to evaluate student writing. And the third grade, we used the high stakes test in Oregon, which at that time was the Oaks test, and it was offered only in English reading. Okay, so here is where it gets fun, but also rather complex. So what we found between English and Spanish reading and writing, that we had effects that ranged from what we call the moderate, which is a 0.42 is a moderate effect size. All of these outcomes favored Literacy Squared kids. Now, what did Literacy Squared kids get that TBE kids did not get? Literacy Squared had a focus on writing and metalinguistic development, as well as oral language. And we started developing literacy in Spanish and English beginning in kindergarten, and didn't do it sequentially with Spanish starting first and then English coming later. So you will notice where we particularly got strong effect sizes were in writing in English at 0.90 in the third grade, reading in English at 0.56. So in all cases, the results favored the kids who were getting Literacy Squared and who were becoming biliterate. Now you might say, but what about English? And what about the high stakes test? Because after all, we've got to do high stakes tests. So the next graph will show you that in this particular study, 69% of the kids in Literacy Squared classrooms either met or exceeded the Oaks test, which was our research question too, but it again was the high stakes test in Oregon, and 49% of the control kids did. I do not want to say anything disparaging about transitional bilingual programs, because they were also doing a good job with kids, but we found that by strengthening it with metalinguistic development and writing, we were getting more of an effect. Okay, so moving on. Our major findings were that our Literacy Squared model led to stronger literacy outcomes in the control group, giving validity to the idea of the Literacy Squared comprehensive instructional framework, which included foundational skills, but was not limited by them. Particularly important was oracy, writing, and metalinguistic development, which we see nowhere in current reforms to reading programs. Across the 3 years, the reading outcomes, we were very happy on the high stakes test. In sum, effective literacy instruction is not a one size fits all program. We've given you two very good examples of programs that were developed specifically for emerging bilingual kids. We'll say it again because it's so important. Effective literacy instruction includes, but is not limited to, foundational skills. And literacy instruction embraces writing as well as reading. Okay, effective literacy instruction includes embracing the dual language brain. We can't treat dual language students as if they are monolingual in English. We have scaffolds to bolster comprehension. Ask any fifth grade teacher who has taught two language kids any amount of time. They will tell you they have a group of children who are very, very effective decoders who cannot understand what they are reading. Let's think about what we're doing. We have supports, the results of our work supports oral language development as the foundation for literacy and emphasizes the development of high levels of biliteracy that can be done at no cost to English and at no cost to Spanish. Both can happen. Okay, so moving forward, here's our concern. The current political, public, and policy focus on increasing literacy for all children should be the invitation to invest in what we know works for English learners. A robust and informed literacy approach based on research on second language learners, and not an open door to repeating the narrow and inadequately informed one-size-fits-all focus on foundational skill approaches and mistakes, underline mistakes of the past. We can't afford to lose another generation. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Esther De Jong, who's going to be issuing or discussing a call for action.
Thank you, Kathy. That sounds like a very powerful piece. I get to call to action. I hope that as you've been listening to both presentations, that you get this sense of urgency that as we could see, the science of reading is kind of informing a lot of investments right now, that we have to start paying attention to make sure that those investments are not exclusive of our kids. And we focus a lot right now on early literacy development and the importance of making sure that what we do and where we invest is informed by the research for and on bilingual learners. If you want to go to the next slide. We know that you represent right now an amazing set of states across the nation. But right now, we want to kind of talk with you and ask you, on a scale from 1 to 5, to what extent is the reason we have shared with you as effective literacy practices being taken into consideration with the rollout of new literacy initiatives and policies in your context? And if we can launch that poll and see to what extent is this part of the thinking and the acting that is happening in your context? We're doing a lot of 1, 2s, and 3s, so it sounds like it's not very much considered in your context. And we want to talk to those of you who said 5. Yes, they are considered. We want to make sure that we get to hear your stories as to how that's being considered and the impact that that has on your initiatives in your particular state. So as you can tell, if we can go to the next slide, we came together as a committee because we felt that the national narrative on reading was so dominated by a particular view and a narrowing of reading that we felt it was really important for us to create our voices and say, we need to also have a perspective that is informed by the research on English language learning. And so we got together a wide group of researchers, teacher educators, teachers, administrators, school board members, advocates from across the nation to say, what is it? How can we collectively give voice to this research so that we can be part of that conversation that's happening nationally? And so our goal with the organization is to make sure that that research gets shared and can inform the policies and practices at both state levels, but also at the district and at the school level. And so for that, we have developed a website, and many of you have been trying to get into that website. And I think by now you have discovered, oh, wait a minute, there is a password protection. And hopefully by now you have seen that if you type in literacy 123, you'll be able to get into that website. You won't need that in the future, but the website will have white papers, the one that we have presented today, and we'll have briefs on different topics related to reading, literacy, and writing development, as it is based on the research for bilingual learners, recognizing that they are unique. So we encourage you to visit the website. And there is an executive summary of the white paper that I think we just dropped into the chat box that we would love for you to read and share with your networks. That being said, if I can go to the next one, here is one thing that you can do right away to help spread the word and invite the people who are currently involved in these reading and early literacy initiatives to say, we need to ask some other questions as well as we move forward. And so you'll see, and I think we just popped this into the chat, we have created a petition that we would love for you to sign onto, and as well as share with your network of people that you know in your context, and to simply say, listen, we do need to invest in literacy. This is crucial for our educational success of all of our learners. But let's do this in a way that is informed, indeed, by research. But let's make sure that that research is based on what we know about bilingual learners, and not only based on a particular group of monolingual English speakers. So I invite you to get to the petition, sign it, and share it with your networks. So that being said, we're going to make sure that we have some time left over for questions. And I'm going to hand it over to my wonderful colleague, Dr. Socorro Herrera, who will be facilitating that discussion.
Thank you, Esther. Lots of great questions, trying to keep up with all of them. Oops. Lots of great questions, trying to keep up with all of them. And so I wish to thank all the panelists and scholars and the educators they represent for this thought-provoking presentation on literacy development for English learners. Clearly, the panel's presentation has prompted many thought-provoking questions about the challenges that we face. And so I selected only a few questions, and in many ways, I've taken representative themes of the collective. So I'm going to start with a question for Lori. And it comes from Catherine Persh. How can we teach bilingual and monolingual students in the same group?
Well, one thing to recognize is there's a range of what we mean by monolingual and bilingual, particularly in many of the diverse communities that we are living in. So our students may have some contact with another language, but not really speak it, or may have some vocabulary in it, but it's not really their home language. You have others who have grown up, totally bilingual in their homes, others who come as what we call English learners without the development of English yet. So all of that mix is present, plus some of our classrooms are super diverse in terms of the languages that are in there. What is important is a language-rich environment. That is one where there's a lot of oral language, there's a lot of teacher modeling of language, there's a lot of engagement of students in active uses of language. And so that oral language piece and the interaction piece is key for all students as the basis for literacy. In terms of approaching literacy, again, that metalinguistic awareness, some students will be coming with a knowledge of another language system. Other students will be monolingual, have only knowledge of one, but leveraging what they can offer to each other by way of comparison of language systems. And, oh, isn't that interesting? They should all become language and literacy detectives in a way. They're entering a multilingual world. So just that as a climate in a classroom, as a set of activities and mindset in the classroom sets you off. The 5 components of effective reading instruction that the national panel put out there, at the very least, we need to be seen to it that we're doing all 5 of those, that the integration of language and language development and literacy development and content knowledge is for all students. And that in itself is something we have to protect right now as the understanding of literacy and language development gets narrower and narrower. So that's for all students. And then ELD, separate ESL, ELD, it's called different things in different places, is essential for our English learners. That separate space where we are giving them the attention to what they need to know about a language that is the native language for English speakers. So ELD as a specific piece of your curriculum, plus a language-rich, comprehensive literacy effort for everybody that involves everyone in developing some metalinguistic awareness and active engagement is really the way to go. And I think that's what the NCEL example really offers.
Thank you, Lori. Kathy, we have a question for you. Can you refer me to a resource that better details what that concurrent literacy development looks like by grade?
Yes. Yes, this is another shameless promotion, but you can read our book. We have a Literacy Squared website. We have, like I said, published many articles and book chapters that detail grade by grade what we're talking about. But in the book, Biliteracy from the Start, we have a grade by grade overview from kindergarten through the 5th grade.
Okay, thank you. And then we have one from Josie from Illinois, and she asks, here in Illinois, we have a proposed structured literacy initiative making its way quickly through the General Assembly. I understand why a narrow literacy approach doesn't work for ELS, but to fight this legislation, we need to know specifically why it's also harmful for general education students. Would be great if you could speak to that. And I'm going to open it to both of you. I know because you both would have a great answer to that.
So I think my answer is similar to what I just spoke to somebody about the classroom level. The National Reading Panel 5 components, comprehensive literacy, is the strongest piece we have about overall reading instruction and literacy instruction. And if nothing else, we need to hold to that and to the fact that foundational skills are just one component for all students and a component that needs to be in the context of the other components. And so the integration of language and literacy, the integration of background knowledge with literacy development is essential for all students. And we've got strong research on that. The narrowing to phonics, the evaluation that I spoke of reading first, actually those findings were for all students. That wasn't just for English learners. About it did improve decoding, but it didn't improve reading comprehension at all. It didn't affect literacy engagement at all. So I think we've got a very strong research base to turn to there about the dangers of a narrow approach for all students.
Kathy, would you like to add to that?
I totally concur with everything that Lori said, and would add that when we said, let's not repeat the mistakes of the past, we were referring specifically to what we learned the last time around, when the focus was clearly on foundational skills and not on comprehension and not on student engagement, that we did not get the outcomes. That large Reading First study was applied to all the kids who were in Reading First programs, including monolingual English-speaking kids. And there were no statistically significant effects on reading comprehension and student engagement. So let's not repeat that mistake.
And let me just say that in the paper, which you all have a link to, and on the website, we have a citation for that evaluation if people want to find it.
Okay, and I think we're almost out of time, but I'm going to go ahead, Lori.
I'm sorry, I just want to speak to secondary for a minute, because I did notice in the chat that there were no.
Well, I was going to say, Lori, then I'm going to ask the question. I didn't know the time, but yes, secondary seemed to really just pop out. And so I had compiled the collective voice of all the secondary people, and they asked, can you speak to high school, particularly for students with interrupted schooling? Home language that doesn't have a writing system, NCEL for secondary students. What role does phonics play at the secondary level? And I think most importantly, if you wrap all of that into sealed with a kiss, I'll say, where do the 8 principles of literacy instruction in mainstream English secondary for mainstream, in mainstream classrooms? So yeah, that seemed to come up quite a bit, but I didn't know if we were out of time. Thank you, Lori.
If I could just do one quick minute on a topic that deserves its own webinar. So there's tremendous diversity at the secondary level in terms of prior experience that those students have had with language, with literacy in their home language or not literacy in their home language. And so the differentiation of the approach at secondary is really crucial. Newcomers, new to the language, who have strength in their own literacy system can transfer very, very quickly into English by focusing on those transfer aspects, et cetera. Those who have interrupted prior schooling, who are not literate in their home language, require a much more kind of foundational skill basis. Those who are long-term English learners, who are basically orally English fluent, but not yet proficient in the academic ways, require another approach. And so one thing would be getting clear on your typologies and the different needs that are there. Another thing that is crucial at secondary is just because they cannot read in English, we cannot be giving them first and second grade books. These are young adults. They need relevant, they need age-appropriate materials, and writing is particularly important as a piece of a secondary approach. So that's my 1 second.
I was going to say, thank you very much. I saw that come over, and I tried to, like I said, find a collective voice of everyone who was asking about secondary. I know there's questions about translanguaging, but I do want to say as we close and that there'll be additional webinars, and that definitely the secondary questions, we should reserve a whole webinar, because I think that there is much need to address some of the challenges we're facing in secondary yet. So thank you.